The courtroom was silent in the way only a courtroom can be. Thick, heavy, suffocating. As if even the air understood the consequences of every word spoken inside it. And at the center of that tension stood attorney Maya Brooks, calm, composed, and unshaken on the surface, though beneath that stillness was a storm she had learned long ago how to control. Because surviving in a system that rarely gave you the benefit of the doubt required more than intelligence. It required discipline, restraint, and a memory that never forgot injustice. And today, all eyes were on her as Judge Harold Whitmore leaned forward from his bench, his expression tight with irritation, his gavel resting like a weapon in his hand, and his voice cutting through the silence with cold authority as he declared that her conduct in the courtroom was unprofessional, disruptive, and borderline contemptuous. Words that echoed louder than they should have, not because they were true, but because they were calculated. And Maya knew it. The opposing counsel knew it. And even the court clerk avoided looking up as if pretending not to notice the imbalance of power unfolding right in front of them. Because this wasn't just about a legal argument anymore. This was about control, about who was allowed to challenge authority and who was expected to stay in line. And Maya had crossed an invisible line the moment she refused to back down when Whitmore interrupted her earlier, cutting off her argument mid-sentence with a dismissive wave of his hand, the kind of gesture that said more than words ever could. But she hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't disrespected the court. She had simply insisted, firmly, clearly, that she be allowed to finish presenting evidence that could change the outcome of the case, and that, it seemed, was enough to trigger the judge's wrath, because men like Whitmore weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Maya. And as he lifted the gavel and brought it down, with a sharp crack that made a few people flinch, he announced the fine, $5,000, for contempt of court, a punishment so excessive, so disproportionate, that even the opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke, no one objected, and Maya simply nodded once, her expression unreadable, as if she had expected this all along. And in that moment, as whispers began to ripple through the gallery, something changed, not in the room, but in her. Because what Judge Whitmore didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly have realized, was that the woman he had just tried to humiliate wasn't just another lawyer trying to make a name for herself. She was someone who had spent years quietly building a reputation, not just in courtrooms, but in places far beyond them. Places where decisions weren't shouted across benches, but made behind closed doors, documented, recorded, and preserved. And as she gathered her files and thanked the court in a voice so steady, it almost sounded detached, she wasn't thinking about the fine or the embarrassment or even the case itself. She was thinking about something much bigger, something that had been sitting in the background for years, waiting, dormant, like a loaded weapon that had never been fired. And now, for the first time, she was considering whether it was time to pull the trigger, because $5,000 wasn't the real cost of what had just happened. The real cost would come later, and it wouldn't be paid by her. And as she walked out of the courtroom, past the curious stares and the quiet murmurs, her phone buzzed in her bag, a message from someone she hadn't spoken to in months, a single line that made her pause just long enough to read it again. Did that just happen? And she didn't respond. Not yet, because timing mattered. And she had learned that the hard way, back when she was still new, still believing that truth alone was enough to win, back before she understood how deeply flawed the system could be. And as she stepped outside into the sharp afternoon light, she took a slow breath and let the door close behind her, sealing the courtroom and everything that had just happened on the other side. But the story didn't end there, not even close, because what Judge Whitmore had just set in motion was something far beyond his control, something that reached back years into a past he thought had been buried, forgotten, erased. But Maya remembered, because she had been there, not in the courtroom, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, watching, documenting, learning, and waiting for the day when the truth would matter more than power. And that day, whether he realized it or not, had just begun. And over the next few days, as the story of the fine quietly spread through legal circles, whispered about in hallways, and discussed behind closed doors, Maya didn't react publicly. She didn't file an immediate complaint. She didn't go to the press, because she understood something most people didn't. Real power wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It moved quietly, deliberately, and when it finally acted, it didn't miss. And while Whitmore went about his routine, confident, dismissive, perhaps even amused by the idea that he had put her in her place, he had no idea that a review had already begun, not officially, not yet, but informally, quietly, initiated by people who paid attention to patterns, not incidents. And Maya's name carried weight with those people, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it, case by case, year by year, until even those who disagreed with her respected her integrity. And when she finally sat down that evening at her desk, alone, the city lights flickering outside her window, she opened a file she hadn't touched in a long time, a file with a name that most people would recognize, but few would understand the full significance of, because it wasn't just a record, it was a timeline, a pattern, a story of its own, one that connected decisions, complaints, dismissed concerns, and overlooked warnings, all pointing back to one man. And as she scrolled through the documents, her expression didn't change, but her focus sharpened. Because this wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about accountability, about ensuring that what had happened to her today didn't continue happening to others who didn't have the same resources, the same connections, or the same patience. And somewhere, deep in the system, there were people who understood that. People who had been waiting for someone like Maya to bring them something undeniable, something they couldn't ignore. And as she picked up her phone and finally responded to the message she had received earlier, her words were simple, measured, and precise. Yes, and I think it's time. And that was all it took to set everything else in motion. Because within days, what had started as a single moment in a courtroom began to unravel into something much larger. A quiet investigation that no one outside a small circle knew about. A review of past cases, past decisions, past complaints that had been filed and dismissed, overlooked or buried. And as the pieces began to come together, a picture emerged, one that was far more damaging than any single incident could ever be. A pattern of behavior that raised questions not just about judgment, but about fairness, about bias, about whether the authority entrusted to one man had been used the way it was supposed to be. And while all of this was happening behind the scenes, Judge Whitmore remained unaware, continuing his work, issuing rulings, maintaining the same demeanor that had defined his career. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. A request for records here, a question raised there, a conversation that stopped when he entered the room. And though he couldn't quite place it, he could feel it. The change in the air, the sense that something wasn't quite right. And by the time he finally realized that the fine he had imposed so casually had triggered something far beyond his control, it was already too late. Because the system he had relied on to protect him was now the same system examining him. And at the center of it all was a woman he had underestimated, dismissed, and tried to silence. A woman who hadn't needed to raise her voice to be heard, because when the truth is strong enough, it doesn't need volume, it needs time. And Maya Brooks had given it exactly that. And in the end, when the findings were presented, when the conclusions could no longer be ignored, when the consequences finally arrived, they didn't come with a gavel or a raised voice. They came quietly, formally, and definitively in the form of a decision that would end a career built over decades. A decision that made it clear that no one, no matter how powerful, was above accountability. And as the news finally broke, spreading far beyond the courtroom where it had all begun, people reacted the way they always do, with shock, with debate, with opinions. But for Maya, it wasn't about any of that. It was about something much simpler, something far more important, the knowledge that what had happened to her hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of something that mattered. Something that would make a difference, not just for her, but for everyone who came after. And as she walked into her next case, her posture steady, her focus clear, there was no trace of triumph on her face, no sign that she had just been at the center of something that would be talked about for years, because that wasn't why she had done it. And as the courtroom settled into silence once again, a different judge presiding, a different atmosphere filling the room, she began to speak, her voice calm, confident, and impossible to ignore. And this time, no one interrupted.